In this episode of Newt's World, the Florida Everglades are known as the River of Grass and are one of the wonders of the world. It is a vast subtropical wilderness that has been declared a World Heritage Site, International Biosphere Reserve, and wetland of international importance. The Everglades spans across 1.5 million acres that stretches over the southern part of Florida. It is home to over 450,000 acres of mangrove forest, the largest continuous seagrass meadow on Earth, the oldest cypress trees on the planet, and over 350 different animal species, many of them threatened or endangered. Here, to talk about the restoration of the Florida Everglades, I am really delighted to welcome my guest, Eric Eichenberg. He is the CEO of the Everglades Foundation. Eric, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege. Thank you for having me.
My son-in-law, Paul Lubbers, was passionate about what you're doing and asked me to get you involved. And I thought maybe we'd start for most of our audience. Can you talk about the history of the Everglades going back to the 1800s?
I know you're a student of history, Mr. Speaker, and there's been quite a bit here within the Everglades. Back in the 1800s, two future presidents of the United States were in the Everglades, Zachary Taylor and Andrew Jackson. The history of the Everglades is long. There were certainly challenges within the history as it relates to the Native Americans that called the Everglades home many centuries ago. We all know we're in an election cycle this year and go back to the election of 1900. A candidate for governor of Florida, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, running for governor, and the enemy at the time was not his opponent, but water. And he, along with a variety of allies, began the process of draining the Everglades, removing water from the peninsula of Florida. And that, Mr. Speaker, really started the effort to lose this natural ecosystem for development purposes. We can certainly talk about those results, but the history is long, it's deep.
Let me slow you down. Why were they trying to drain the Everglades? Was it to get land that they could develop or what?
Yes, sir. Development pressures at the turn of that century were certainly beginning. Fort Dallas in South Florida was an outpost that was growing. Ultimately, the city of Miami, Fort Lauderdale, as these developments or these urban areas began to take shape, that land, those wetlands, those iconic wetlands were then targeted for draining, and that organic peat soil that's even there today was utilized for the development of South Florida. I might add that Miami International Airport, where you, I'm sure, have flown in and out of over the years, that is built on historic Everglades. So certainly for development purposes.
That became the first phase. But then wasn't there a big effort by the Audubon Society and others to really begin to recognize how unique the Everglades were?
No doubt about it. Certainly the Audubon, the significance of the trade, the bird trade, to ensure that the species that call the Everglades home, these magnificent birds, wading birds, all types were preserved. And Audubon Society, when it came to for over 100 years ago, really shined the light on the need to protect this natural resource. And over the decades, a lot of attention has been given to the now 78 endangered and threatened species that call the Everglades home, including the iconic snail kite. These animals are critically important to this ecosystem. And as we talk about restoration, these efforts are making sure that these animals and these plants survive future generations.
Feathers for women's hats were a big factor and were actually leading to the extinction of attractive species. And so many of the conservation efforts were designed to keep the species that are unique and beautiful and otherwise would have been destroyed commercially.
Those hats being sold in New York and Chicago, and folks wondering where did they come from. And it was explained down in South Florida, down in the state of Florida. And as people were being educated on how this bird population was being decimated, it really did drive the conservation focus and purpose to preserve.
So what led to the creation of the Everglades National Park in 1947?
It was an amazing time because at that similar time, Congress was debating the Central and South Florida floodplain, which was passed during the Truman administration, which began to build the canals and implementing the dams and dikes within South Florida in particular. There's a maze of canals, thousands of miles of canals that were dug by the Army Corps of Engineers after that congressional authorization in the 1940s. And all that fresh water on the Florida Peninsula was drained out to the Atlantic Ocean, from West Palm Beach to Fort Lauderdale down to Miami. It was also realized that fresh water had to flow down to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. And there was land. I had the privilege of working a couple years back at the law firm of Holland and Knight. Spessard Holland was the governor of Florida in the late 1940s and negotiated a deal with the federal government to allow state land to be purchased by the feds, which then became Everglades National Park. And a wonderful event that took place in December of 1947 when President Truman came to Florida and dedicated that national park, Everglades National Park, as a landmark ecosystem right here in our own backyard in Florida. And we've been now decades later doing all we can to make sure water flows south to the park. That is the beneficiary of all this work that's been going on, Everglades National Park.
At that time, was there opposition from people who wanted to develop all of South Florida, who didn't understand the importance?
From what I've read and what I understand, it was a mix of efforts to conserve and the need to make sure these lands in the southern part of our peninsula were preserved, but also to allow for development. Back in the 40s and 50s, 7-8 million people, maybe 13 million statewide. The issue was continuing to encroach out towards the Everglades. I-95, when the interstate system came around in the 1950s, it enabled even more people to come down to South Florida. So that encroachment, that is the balance between allowing development of South Florida along with the protection, not just of Everglades National Park, but now we have Biscayne National Park, we have the Big Cypress Preserve, and we have the River of Grass, the Central Everglades that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote about so eloquently also in 1947. So it's a great balance, Mr. Speaker, of the ability to have development, yet also protect these natural resources and this precious ecosystem.
And if I remember correctly, Truman himself would go to Key West for his sort of winter vacation. So, I mean, he had an awareness and affinity for Florida.
He sure did. The little White House there in Key West, if listeners haven't had a chance, if next time folks are down in Key West, I highly recommend it. It's a great historical location there. But Harry Truman loved Key West. Decades later, President Nixon would reside and spend time on Key Biscayne and also understand the importance of the ecosystem, not only in Biscayne National Park, but also the Everglades as a whole.
You talk about there's like 350 different animal species in the Everglades. Some of them are now introduced. I mean, the python, for example, which I guess was a byproduct of a hurricane in 1992, knocking down a building which was a hatchery for baby pythons. And they suddenly found, wow, here's this wonderful swamp that felt a lot like Burma. And they become sort of an apex predator, haven't they?
They have, and the numbers are chilling. Hundreds of thousands of pythons. Quite frankly, we really don't know the impact that they're having in the Everglades. We do know that the fur-bearing animals that call the Everglades home, the rabbits, the raccoons, a lot of them, those populations have been decimated. I recall finally just years ago driving from Miami to Naples along Tamiami Trail, US 41, and seeing a variety of bunny rabbits both on the north and south side of that road. I haven't seen a rabbit or a raccoon for many years. So the python population was introduced, that invasive species. And we have others too, plants and trees as well. You were in South Florida back in 97 as speaker, and you raised the concern about Melaleuca, the invasive Melaleuca plant. And if you recall, they were releasing beetles into the Everglades to eat the Melaleuca so it could contain that invasive species. So we're challenged by a variety of species that are introduced.
I am curious, between the alligator and the python, who ends up as the apex?
You can see some video. It's troubling, quite frankly, but sometimes the python wins and sometimes the alligator comes out on top. It was recently reported that coyotes had munched on a clutch of python eggs. So potentially there's a predator now to eat some of these. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida, one of their python experts, there was a 16-foot python taken out of the ecosystem. That autopsy or so showed 87 eggs inside of this female snake. So they're quite prolific. And again, it's a big problem.
My daughter and her husband were out walking near Key Biscayne, actually on Key Biscayne, a couple of weeks ago, and they literally just walked up on two crocodiles. They were just sort of laying there. And I think people don't realize you have both American alligators and American crocodiles in the ecosystem down there.
Mr. Speaker, it's the only place in the world where a crocodile and an alligator can coexist. And I tell my Republican and Democrat friends, if that can happen in Florida, then both parties can come together to ensure that the Everglades is protected for generations to come.
Is it true that the crocodile is a little more capable of dealing with salt water?
Correct. The crocodile is a saltwater species. You're absolutely right. And this alligator in fresh water. And, we have three critical estuaries on the Florida Peninsula. Florida Bay down in the Keys is an estuary where you see that mix of crocodile and alligator, the mix of saltwater and freshwater. These estuaries are critically important for that balance. I like to call it the Goldilocks effect. The fisheries and the birds and the habitats, you need to have a good balance between freshwater, saltwater for these species to thrive.
One of the things that really amazes me in South Florida is, you really can access the Everglades easily, whether you're in Miami or you're in Fort Myers and Naples. It's right there. You don't have to go any great distance at all.
25-minute drive, either east or west, and you're in the heart of that ecosystem. It stretches, as we point out, from Miami, the Florida Keys, up to Broward County, West Palm Beach, even Lake Okeechobee, which is the heartbeat of the Everglades. And that beautiful Kissimmee River north of Lake Okeechobee, that floodplain extends from Orlando south in the central part of the state, again, all the way down to Lake Okeechobee. So it's about the size of the state of New Jersey. You can access it very easily from either the west or east coast. Tremendous ecotourism opportunities for folks.
Lake Okeechobee is critical to the survival of the Everglades. And at the same time, because of agriculture, it has a huge loading of pollution and particularly nutrients that causes a real challenge for the quality of the water going into the Everglades. Can you walk us through the whole dilemma of dealing correctly with Lake Okeechobee?
Well, I appreciate you bringing this up because the lake is a special place for many people. Great bass fishing, tremendous bass fishing tournaments that take place in Florida around Lake Okeechobee. But as you point out, over the decades, nutrient pollution, primarily phosphorus, has negatively impacted Lake Okeechobee. For years, the sugar industry south of the lake, about 500,000 acres of sugarcane production, the industry was back pumping its dirty water into the lake because you couldn't send it south to the Everglades. So dirty water being dumped into the lake, you had point source pollution from dairy farms, some cattle ranching, agricultural interests. You certainly have communities around the lake now that are on septic tanks that are adding to the pollution. Lake Okeechobee is a sick body of water as we visit here today. And it is no longer acting as a sponge to take the nutrients and to absorb those pollutants. It's now becoming its own source. As we visit here today, about 45% of the lake is covered in blue-green algae. And as the summer rolls on and the temperatures rise, by July, August, you're going to see almost 90% of the lake covered in a neo-green algae form. And that is extremely troubling because, again, as the lake rises, the Army Corps of Engineers has one option at this moment, and that's to open the gates on the east and west side, and all that pollution gets dumped to the St. Lucie River to the east and to the Caloosahatchee River to the west. And it's quite troubling to the Florida economy.
And what does that do to the ecosystem of the lake to have that much algae?
Oh, it's terrible. The fish is impacted by it. You certainly don't have enough vegetation to absorb the phosphorus out of the water. The water table is consumed by excess phosphorus. So the lake is managed right now in a way that it gets so high, and at times when we have drought conditions, it gets extremely low. The good news is there's a plan coming this August, which will give the Army Corps of Engineers greater balance in how they manage Lake Okeechobee, because it's its own ecosystem. And it needs to be managed so that water will flow south. We have the mechanism now, actually, thanks to your speakership. There is land south of all those sugarcane fields that can treat this water. And we want to deliver as much water possible from Lake Okeechobee down to the Everglades and ultimately to Everglades National Park and Florida Bay.
I mean, if you don't do that, don't you only have saltwater intrusion from the south if you have inadequate fresh water coming in?
We saw that in 2015 because we were not getting fresh water flowing south. You had salinity levels in Florida Bay, down in the Keys, 10 times as salty as the ocean. And we had 50,000 acres, Mr. Speaker, of dead seagrass floating on the surface of that estuary. They called it zombie grass. And from the tourism-based economy of the Florida Keys to the great fishery to the wading bird population, all was impacted because we're not getting enough water flowing in the direction God created, which is south from Lake Okeechobee.
So how much of this also relates to the sugar industry?
It's a heavy relation to the sugar industry. It's been there predominantly since the 1930s, certainly was elevated after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. In the 60s, it expanded. So again, you have just under 500,000 acres directly south of the lake, which is sugarcane production. And it's propped up by a federal system. You're familiar with the program, a program that inflates the price domestically. So we pay twice the price for sugar here in the United States than they do on the world market. But quite frankly, there in the middle, the effort here is to get water flowing south. There are 70,000 acres south of those sugar fields that act as kidneys for the Everglades so that you're effectively removing phosphorus and nitrogen from the water. And that kick-started in 1996 when you led efforts to put money in the Farm Bill to buy the Talisman Sugar Company. And those lands today are being used to treat the water and send that clean water south to the Everglades.
I found to my great chagrin, the very first time I ran in 1974, I had sugar reform as one of my campaign themes. And I discovered once I got to Congress that it's actually not the cane sugar guys that are the problem. It's because beet sugar is raised all over the country. And the beet sugar guys figured out that the cane sugar guys were the proxy for the highest possible price. And that they would actually pay a much lower price for beet sugar if the cane sugar guys weren't protecting them. And so, because you have very little cane sugar really raised in the U.S. anymore. Louisiana, tiny bit in Hawaii and Florida. But they are absolutely protected by state after state that has these beet sugar farmers. And so it's really a hard program to reform. And yet it was clear that the cost to the ecosystem in South Florida was far greater than the economic benefit. I'm glad that we won phase one of that fight. We probably still have some more to come in the future. But one of the things I'm very impressed with, there was a poll from Florida Atlantic University and the National Parks Conservation Association. 89% of Floridians value the conservation of Florida's natural resources. 86% of Floridians agree that leaders have an obligation to protect and restore the Everglades. 83% believe investigating an Everglades restoration is critical for Florida's climate-resilient future. And 85% of the respondents in Miami-Dade County agree that the Everglades and our sensitive lands and waters must be protected from harmful overdevelopment. That's really an amazing public coalescence around a set of ideas. And you must find in that sense that you're operating in a relatively friendly environment.
In a time of divisiveness, yes, it is an issue that brings everyone together because it is about water. It's all about water. South Florida, as we turn on the tap in South Florida, it is fueled by the Everglades, the Biscayne Aquifer. So regardless of your socioeconomic background or your political ideology, we all need water in South Florida to survive. So it's very unifying. And I might add, too, that back in 2014, 76% of Florida voters amended the state constitution to siphon 1/3 of real estate tax. Every time a real estate transaction occurs, 1/3 of those taxes are now put into a conservation trust fund for Everglades restoration, for beach renourishment, for protection of our natural springs in North Florida. So conservation is very much on the mind of Florida voters. And this generation of Floridians understands what's at stake, the economics of Florida. And we need to do all we can to get across that finish line. And I'm optimistic we're going to do it by the end of the decade.
Part of this is that people say that the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir is sort of the crown jewel of restoring the Everglades. Can you walk us through why? I mean, what does that mean?
It is the project within the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan that is now 24 years in the making. This project, once built, and it's scheduled by the Army Corps to be completed by the end of the decade, it will be the reconnection of Lake Okeechobee water down to the Florida Keys. So again, we talked about the pollution and the polluted water in Lake Okeechobee. It will move through massive canals, through the sugar fields. It will fill up this reservoir 35 feet high. It's going to hold about 28 feet of water, roughly 78 to 80 billion gallons. The water will trickle out of this reservoir and will go into this maze of wetlands. The plants that are in these wetlands effectively remove the pollution from the water, and then you're distributing through a natural sheet flow, again, as God designed the Everglades, for that water to flow south. So this reservoir is the source of water for South Florida. It will recharge the aquifer. It will provide benefits to the fishing industry, to the boating industry. It'll protect real estate investments. When Bill Clinton signed the comprehensive plan in December of 2000, it was this project that was listed in the Water Resources Development Act of 2000. Here we are now 24 years later, and it's finally coming out of the ground, Mr. Speaker. It is a critical project, and it's well on its way.
Somebody pointed out that it's the largest ecosystem restoration project in the entire world.
It's about a $4 billion project. It's the largest reservoir the Army Corps of Engineers will ever have built. But when you look at the comprehensive plan, something that you were critically influential as it moved towards authorization by Congress years ago, once finished, some $28 billion estimated final cost, it will be the largest ecosystem restoration effort in the history of the world.
Now, the Everglades Foundation, for over 30 years, has been committed to restoring and protecting the Everglades. Can you talk a little bit about what the foundation has done and what drives it?
Yes, sir. It started in Islamorada down in the Keys. Two fishing buddies, the late George Barley and Paul Tudor Jones, were neighbors in Islamorada, and they saw an algae bloom in Florida Bay. And they were asking scientists, what is happening? What's going on with this tremendous estuary? And it was pointed out that all the pollution coming from the north, flowing through the Everglades, it needed to be resolved. So that kickstarted the Everglades Foundation to now 30 years later, science-based organization. We have great experts in the science of the Everglades, the hydrology, the biology, the chemistry, the economics of the Everglades. And we take the science, and Mr. Speaker, you can appreciate, you can have science all day long, but then you have to work the political science. You have to be in Washington and in Tallahassee working with policymakers to ensure that funding, that money flows to these critical projects that are part of this comprehensive plan. And then it's also to educate not only the current generation, but future generations. And our education program is spreading across Florida. Every child that graduates from a Florida school will be literate in the importance of the Everglades, because there will be a day when we achieve restoration, and then we're going to pass it off to that next generation for perpetual protection. The Everglades Foundation has been leading the way on this for, as you point out now, over 31 years.
I noticed that you used to work with a very good friend of mine, Representative Clay Shaw, who really did a remarkable job of leadership on this project.
He's my mentor. I miss him every day. He left us too early. Clay Shaw understood, as a Florida native, the importance of the Everglades. He worked across the aisle, not just on the Everglades, but welfare reform, which I know you were heavily engaged in back in 95 and 96, as well as protecting our seniors as the chairman of the Ways and Means Social Security Committee. So Clay Shaw understood what was important to Floridians, but as it related to the Everglades, he took great pride in the fact that he worked to get that historic plan passed in 2000. And I'm just privileged to be carrying on his legacy each and every day at the Everglades Foundation.
What do you do as the CEO of the foundation?
Well, I manage a great team. I take the adage that you surround yourself with people smarter than you, and I have done that. We have, again, a great team of scientists. We have advocates. We have policy experts, and we're at the forefront. We are constantly working with our congressional delegation, with members of Congress from other states who are on the Appropriations Committee and the authorizing committees. We have a great partnership with Governor DeSantis and the Florida legislature to move this forward. And then we also work with a broad coalition. And Mr. Speaker, I'm most proud of the fact in the last couple of years, we've engaged tremendously Florida realtors. We've engaged chambers of commerce along the Florida coast, small business owners, fishing guides, boat manufacturers, everyone who thrives on a tourism-based economy, because that's what this state is now driven by, tourism. And the Everglades Foundation brings people together to ensure that we accomplish the job, we achieve restoration, and we do it in a very collaborative spirit, and we operate with government at the highest levels.
If somebody wants to get involved, if they listen to this and they're intrigued with helping the Everglades, how can they be involved with the Everglades Foundation?
Well, I appreciate that. Before I answer your question, I want to point out that you have a quote back in 1997 where you said that the Everglades is a laboratory. It's a laboratory not only for the state of Florida, but for the world. And we have to get this right. And we will. And others are watching very closely on how we accomplish success here in the Everglades. Those folks that are listening who this topic interests them, I encourage you to go to evergladesfoundation.org, our website. We have a tremendous amount of information on that webpage that can bring you up to speed on what's at stake here. We cover all the social media platforms with concise information, important information. Folks need to come off the sidelines, if you will, and understand what's at stake here. The Florida economy is at stake, our resource, our water, the endangered and threatened species. But more importantly, I put this in the same light as the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite. We've got a national park here that is the beneficiary, and every American should rally to make sure we protect Everglades National Park and the Everglades as a whole.
I can tell you that I'm very excited by what you're doing. Of the many things I got involved with in my career, I used to teach environmental studies, and I've had a long, passionate interest in natural history. And one of the things I was proudest of as speaker was helping launch the restoration of the Everglades. So this chance to chat with you, Eric, and to talk about all this and to encourage our listeners to go to your website, evergladesfoundation.org. I just think it's a terrific thing. And if they want to visit the Everglades, they can go to the National Park Service website at nps.gov. And I recommend highly, if you've never seen what a remarkable ecosystem this is, the Everglades ought to be part of any trip you take to Florida. So, Eric, thank you so much for sharing with us.
I look forward to seeing you in Florida.
Thank you to my guest, Eric Eichenberg. You can get a link to the Everglades Foundation website on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.